At sunrise, the bank manager rang my doorbell with a foreclosure notice. My stepson stood at the end of my driveway, recording on his phone, shouting loud enough to wake the whole street. "Pack your bags, old man. This place belongs to the bank now, and the bank belongs to me." I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at the manager and asked one quiet question. "Whose name is on the loan documents you're holding?" The manager glanced down, flipped a page, then went still. The color drained right out of his face. "Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. I always like knowing where my listeners are." My name is Walter Brennan. I'm 71 years old, and I've lived on Magnolia Bend Road in Savannah, Georgia for 38 years. Before I retired 6 years ago, I spent 32 years as a federal bank examiner with the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. My job, in plain English, was to walk into financial institutions and figure out who was lying, who was cooking the books, and who was about to take other people's money for a ride. I'd seen mortgage fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, shell companies, every dirty trick a man with a calculator and bad intentions can dream up. I thought I'd retired into peace. Turns out, the worst case of my career was waiting for me in my own kitchen. My wife Eleanor passed 4 years ago this spring. Cancer took her in 9 months, and there isn't a morning I wake up that I don't reach across the empty side of the bed. She came into our marriage with a son, Brandon, from her first marriage. Brandon was 11 when Eleanor and I got married, a quiet boy who loved baseball and his mother's banana bread. I never tried to replace his daddy. I just tried to be steady, present, the kind of man who shows up to your school plays and teaches you how to change a tire. For a long time, I thought I'd done all right by him. Brandon married a woman named Crystal 7 years ago. I'll be honest with you, I never warmed to her. She had that smile that didn't reach her eyes, and she always asked questions about money, our cars, our furniture, the appraised value of the house, the kind of questions a polite Southern woman doesn't ask. But Eleanor adored her, and I kept my mouth shut for Eleanor's sake. After my wife died, Brandon and Crystal started coming around more. At first I was grateful. I was lonely. The house felt cavernous, without Eleanor's footsteps in the hall. Crystal would bring casseroles and sit at the kitchen table asking me about how I was holding up, how the mortgage was looking, whether I'd thought about updating my will now that things had changed. I should have heard the music underneath those questions. I didn't. That was the first mistake I made. The second mistake was about 10 months ago, when Brandon told me he wanted to refinance my house to help me lower my monthly payments. I'd paid off the mortgage 12 years prior, and I told him so. He laughed and said, "No, Walt, I mean a reverse mortgage. You're sitting on equity, and the house could be working for you instead of just sitting there." I told him I'd think about it. He brought it up again the next visit, and the next. Crystal would chime in, talking about how Eleanor would have wanted me to enjoy my retirement, take a cruise, fix up the kitchen. They were so persistent that I finally agreed to let Brandon look into the paperwork with a banker friend of his. I figured it couldn't hurt to have a conversation. That was the third mistake, and it was the one that nearly cost me everything. Over the next 4 months, Brandon would show up about every 2 weeks with manila folders, disclosure forms, he called them. Authorization sheets so the bank could pull my credit, run an appraisal, look at my retirement accounts to confirm I had income to support the loan. I read the first few pages of the first folder carefully. After that, I'll admit, I started just signing where he flagged. He was my stepson. Eleanor had loved him. He'd buried his mother right there next to me at Bonaventure Cemetery. What kind of man suspects a boy who cried on his shoulder at his mama's funeral? A smarter man than I was, that's what kind. The morning the foreclosure notice arrived, I was in my back garden, deadheading Eleanor's roses. She'd planted those roses the year we moved in, and I've kept them alive through 3 hurricanes and 2 droughts because letting them die feels like letting her die again. The doorbell rang at 6:43 in the morning. I remember the time exactly because I just glanced at my watch and thought how quiet the neighborhood still was. I came around the side of the house wiping my hands on a rag, and there stood a man in a navy suit holding a leather portfolio, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Brennan? I'm Howard Pemberton, branch manager from Coastal Heritage Bank on Abercorn Street. I'm here to formally serve you with a notice of foreclosure on this property." His voice was professional, but his eyes kept drifting toward the street. I followed his gaze. There at the end of my driveway, leaning against a brand new black Lincoln Navigator, was Brandon. He had his phone held up, recording. When he saw me look at him, he grinned wide and called out, "Smile for the camera, Walt! This is going to be great content." Then he shouted that line about the house belonging to the bank and the bank belonging to him. Crystal sat in the passenger seat, sunglasses on, scrolling her phone like she was bored. She didn't even bother to look up. I turned back to Mr. Pemberton. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned a long time ago that the louder a man gets, the less powerful he becomes. "May I see the documents, please?" He handed me the portfolio. Inside was a foreclosure complaint, a copy of a reverse mortgage agreement dated about 7 months back, and a payoff demand. The mortgage was for $412,000, drawn against my house, with my signature on every page. The default notice claimed I'd missed 11 months of property tax escrow payments, and was now in violation of the loan terms. The lender was listed as Coastal Heritage Bank. The cosigner on the file, with full payee authority, was Brandon Mitchell, my stepson. I looked at those documents the way I'd looked at 1,000 suspicious files over 32 years, and I saw 4 things wrong before I'd finished the second page. First, the date on the original loan was a Sunday. No federal bank closes a residential loan on a Sunday. Not legally, not without a special exception that has to be documented in the file, and there was no such documentation. Second, my social security number on the application had 2 digits transposed. I've memorized that number since 1972, and I do not get it wrong, ever. Third, the appraisal attached to the file was from a company I'd never heard of, with no certification number listed, and the appraised value was nearly $80,000 below market. That's the kind of low appraisal that lets a fraudster pull cash out without flagging the bank's risk algorithms. And fourth, the notary stamp was from a notary commissioned in Effingham County. I'd never set foot in an Effingham County notary's office. Every legal document I'd signed in the last 20 years had been notarized by Marlene Woodruff at the credit union on Victory Drive, 2 miles from my house. I lifted my eyes from the papers and looked at Mr. Pemberton. Really looked at him. He was a man maybe in his early 50s, with the careful posture of someone who follows procedure to the letter. And then I saw his name tag again, and something tickled at the back of my mind. "Howard Pemberton," I said slowly. "Did you used to work at First Federated of Atlanta? Late 90s? He blinked. I did. Compliance department, before I moved into branch operations. How did you... I audited your branch in 1998. The Buckhead office. I was the federal examiner who flagged your supervisor for steering minority applicants into subprime products. You testified at the consent decree hearing. You were the one who came forward." The man's mouth opened slightly. He stared at me, and I watched the recognition wash across his face like a slow tide coming in. Walter Brennan. Good God. You were OCC. 32 years. Retired 6 years ago. I tapped the foreclosure complaint against the back of my hand. "Mr. Pemberton, I'd like you to step inside with me for a moment. I need to show you something." Out at the end of the driveway, Brandon had stopped grinning. He'd lowered his phone. I think he could tell, even from 60 feet away, that something in the air had shifted. I didn't look at him. I led Mr. Pemberton into my kitchen, where Eleanor's blue-checkered curtains still hung in the window above the sink, and I poured the man a cup of coffee like he was a guest, instead of a process server. In Eleanor's old sewing room, which I'd converted into a small home office after she passed, I keep a fireproof file cabinet. In that cabinet, I keep every important document I've ever signed. The deed to the house from 1987, my discharge papers from the Navy, our marriage certificate, Eleanor's death certificate, and a complete folder of every financial document I've executed since my retirement, with my actual signature, my actual notary, and my actual social security number listed correctly. I pulled out 3 documents from the last 2 years and brought them back to the kitchen. Compare the signatures, Mr. Pemberton. Pay attention to the slope of the W. Pay attention to the loop on the B. And while you're at it, look up my social security number against any of these legitimate documents. Then look at the application your bank approved. I slid them across the kitchen table. He sat down. He took out a pair of reading glasses. And he studied those papers for almost 5 full minutes without saying a word. When he finally looked up, his face had gone gray. "Mr. Brennan, this loan should not have been approved. I'm going to be honest with you. This file went through our underwriting 2 states away because the originator marked it as a special handling case. The co-signer, your stepson, he came in twice in person to provide documentation. He told us you were homebound and unable to come into the branch, and that he had power of attorney. He paused, then added very carefully, "We have a power of attorney document on file, notarized, dated 13 months ago. I never granted my stepson power of attorney over anything. Not my house, not my finances, not my medical decisions. I want to see that document." He nodded, took out a tablet, and pulled up a scanned image. There it was. A general durable power of attorney, with my signature, naming Brandon Mitchell as my attorney in fact for all financial matters. Notarized by the same Effingham County notary. Dated 13 months prior, during a week when I'd been in Asheville visiting my brother, and could prove it with credit card receipts, gas station purchases, and a photograph my brother had posted on Facebook of the two of us at the Biltmore. "Mr. Pemberton," I said, "I'm going to ask you to stay right here for a few more minutes. And I'm going to ask you, as a former compliance officer, to do me one professional courtesy. I'd like you to walk back out to that driveway with me, and I'd like you to inform my stepson that this foreclosure is suspended pending an internal review of the loan file. Not canceled. Suspended. Pending review. Can you do that?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I can do that." When we walked back out into the morning sun, Brandon had gotten out of his Lincoln and was halfway up the driveway, no longer recording, looking impatient. Crystal had finally taken off her sunglasses. Mr. Pemberton, to his credit, delivered the message with the flat tone of a man who'd suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of a crime scene. "Mr. Mitchell, the foreclosure action is being placed on administrative hold pending an internal compliance review of the loan origination. Coastal Heritage Bank will be in contact with both parties. Good morning." Brandon's face went through about 4 colors in 5 seconds. "Hold? What do you mean hold? You served the papers. He's in default. You can't just—" "I can, and I just did, sir. Good morning." Mr. Pemberton walked back to his car. I stood at the top of my driveway, hands in my pockets, and I watched my stepson stare at me like he was trying to figure out what had just happened. I didn't say a word. After a minute, Crystal got out of the Navigator and stalked over to him, hissing something I couldn't hear. Brandon shoved his phone in his pocket and pointed a finger at me from across the lawn. "This isn't over, Walt. You signed those papers. We've got the documentation." I just looked at him. I looked at the boy I'd raised from age 11, the boy I'd taught to drive in the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly, the boy whose mother I'd buried beside the magnolia tree at Bonaventure, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder than anger, something more useful. I went back inside and closed the door. I sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and I made 3 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer named Rosalind Tate, who'd been assistant U.S. attorney in Atlanta when I was still working federal cases. She'd gone into private practice in Savannah 6 years back and had a reputation for handling complex financial fraud. She remembered me immediately. She told me to come to her office that afternoon and to bring every document I had. The second call was to a private investigator named Gus Holliday, a retired postal inspector I'd worked alongside on a mail fraud case in 2011. Gus had moved to Hilton Head when he retired, but he still took cases that interested him. I described what had happened in about 90 seconds. He whistled low and said he'd be at my house by noon. The third call was to my brother Hank in Asheville, asking him to email me the receipts and the Facebook photo from 13 months ago. By 8 in the morning, the wheels were turning. Gus got to my house at 11:45. He's a wiry little man with a gray crew cut and the patience of a chess grandmaster. We sat at my kitchen table and I laid everything out. He took notes in a small leather notebook with a fountain pen, asking precise questions in his soft Carolina accent. By the time he left 2 hours later, he had a list of names: Brandon, Crystal, the Effingham County Notary, the appraisal company, and the loan originator at Coastal Heritage Bank. He told me to give him a week. That afternoon, Rosalind Tate sat across from me in her conference room in a high-rise on Bay Street reading the documents. She's a woman in her late 50s with silver hair cropped short and the kind of unblinking calm that I'd seen scare grown men into confessions. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Walter, this is mortgage fraud, identity theft, and forgery. At minimum, the power of attorney is the key." If we can prove you were not in the state when it was supposedly signed, the entire chain of fraud collapses. We file civil immediately to freeze any further action against your home, and we refer this to the FBI's white-collar division, because once you cross state lines with fraudulent loan documents, it's federal. What about the bank? The bank is going to want this to go away quietly. They approved a fraudulent loan. They have liability. Mr. Pemberton's instinct to pause was the smartest thing he could have done for them. We're going to use that to our advantage. And Brandon? Rosalind set down her pen. Mr. Brennan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Do you want this to be made right quietly, with restitution and the loan voided, or do you want this to go all the way? Because there's a difference, and I need to know which path you're on before I file my first motion. I thought about Brandon at age 11, standing in our kitchen, with a baseball glove too big for his hand, looking up at me like I might be the answer to a question he hadn't figured out how to ask. I thought about Eleanor in her hospital bed, holding my hand in the last week of her life, telling me to take care of her boy. I thought about Brandon and Crystal in that Lincoln Navigator at the end of my driveway, recording my eviction for what he called content. All the way, Miss Tate. I want every consequence the law allows. She nodded once. Then we begin. Within 5 days, Gus Holliday had a complete picture, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. Brandon and Crystal had been running a small-time real estate flipping operation that had collapsed in the last housing pullback. They were $320,000 underwater on 2 investment properties in Pooler, behind on the lease on a luxury condo at the Landings, and Crystal had racked up over $40,000 on credit cards opened in a shell LLC's name. The Lincoln Navigator was leased through that LLC. They were drowning, and they'd come up with a plan to wash their debt clean by stealing the equity in my house. The reverse mortgage proceeds, $412,000 minus closing costs, had been wired in 3 transactions to an account at a credit union in Pooler that Brandon had opened using the fraudulent power of attorney. From there, he'd paid down the worst of his debts, covered the lease on the condo, and put $30,000 down on a beach house on Tybee Island that he and Crystal were planning to rent out for income. The default on my loan had been engineered. Brandon had simply stopped making the property tax escrow payments after diverting the proceeds. Knowing the bank would foreclose, the house would be sold at auction, and they'd wash their hands of me. They'd planned to dump me, when the time came, into an extended stay motel out by the airport. Gus had recovered text messages, obtained legally through the FBI subpoena Rosalind had triggered, in which Crystal asked Brandon, "What if he tries to fight the foreclosure?" And Brandon replied, "He's 71, half-deaf. Let him try. By the time it goes to court, we'll be out of the country." Out of the country. That's the part that stayed with me. My wife had begged me to take care of her son, and her son had planned to leave me homeless and disappear to a beach in Belize. The Effingham County notary turned out to be a woman named Darla Hutchins, 54 years old, with a notary commission that had been suspended once before for similar irregularities. Gus drove out to her little office above a tax preparation service in Rincon and had a conversation with her. He didn't threaten her. He just laid out, in his patient Carolina drawl, exactly what the federal investigation was going to look like, and how cooperative witnesses generally fared compared to uncooperative ones. Within 2 days, Darla had given a sworn statement to the FBI. Brandon had paid her $2,000 cash to notarize the power of attorney without my presence. He told her I was housebound and provided her with a photocopy of my driver's license and what he claimed was my pre-signed signature page. She'd done it before for him, she admitted, on a smaller real estate transaction 9 months earlier. The appraiser, a man named Curtis Yelvington, had been getting under-the-table payments for 3 years to deliver low appraisals that helped fraudulent loans clear underwriting. He was already under investigation in 2 other counties. The loan originator at Coastal Heritage Bank, a woman named Patrice Donnelly, had a sister who happened to be Crystal's college roommate. There was a money trail there, too. $5,000 transferred from Crystal's Shell LLC to a personal account belonging to Patrice Donnelly's husband 3 weeks before the loan closed. The whole thing was a tapestry of fraud, and once you pulled one thread, the whole picture came loose. 2 weeks after Mr. Pemberton stood on my front porch, the FBI raided Brandon and Crystal's condo at the Landings at 6 in the morning. They were both arrested on federal charges of mortgage fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The Effingham County notary, the appraiser, and the bank loan officer were all indicted within the month. Coastal Heritage Bank, faced with the prospect of a federal investigation into their lending practices, very quickly agreed to a settlement that voided the fraudulent reverse mortgage in its entirety, restored clear title to my home, and paid me a sum I'm not at liberty to disclose for the harm caused by their negligent underwriting. Mr. Pemberton, as it turned out, was promoted 3 months later. The bank made him head of fraud prevention for the southeastern region. Brandon hired a slick defense attorney out of Atlanta named Reed Voss, the kind of lawyer who shows up to bail hearings in a $4,000 suit. Voss tried, almost immediately, to flip the narrative. He filed a counterclaim accusing me of being mentally incompetent, of having pressured Brandon into the financial arrangements, and of being motivated by jealousy over Brandon's relationship with his late mother. They produced 2 witnesses, neighbors of mine from down the street, a couple named the Hendersons, who claimed they'd seen me arguing with Brandon on multiple occasions and that I'd seemed confused at recent neighborhood gatherings. I'd never had a meaningful conversation with the Hendersons in 15 years. Gus Holliday went to work on them. It turned out that Brandon had loaned Mr. Henderson $18,000 2 years earlier, and the loan had never been repaid. The loan was, in fact, hush money for an affair Brandon had documented evidence of. Mr. Henderson, faced with the prospect of his wife learning about a young woman named Tiffany whom he'd taken to a Marriott in Jacksonville on 3 separate occasions, very quickly recanted his statement. So did his wife. Once she heard the rest of the story from Mrs. Henderson herself, Reed Voss tried other things. He tried to argue that the power of attorney was valid because I'd signed similar documents in the past. Rosalind produced 38 years of correctly notarized documents from my files, all bearing Marlene Woodruff's stamp. He tried to argue that I'd been aware of the loan and had verbally consented. Rosalind produced the credit card receipts, gas station records, and the Facebook photograph proving I'd been in North Carolina the day the power of attorney was supposedly signed. He tried to argue diminished capacity. Rosalind produced a certified neuropsychological evaluation from Dr. Esme Goldfarb at Emory, which placed my cognitive function in the 97th percentile for my age group. By the time we got to the federal sentencing hearing, Reed Voss was a man who had run out of moves and was simply trying to keep his client out of a long sentence. It didn't work. The federal judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Drummond, was not a forgiving woman when it came to financial crimes against the elderly. She had a daughter who worked in adult protective services in Chatham County, and she'd seen, secondhand, what happens to old people who get cleaned out by their own kin. When she handed down the sentence, she did not mince words. Brandon Mitchell, for his role as the principal architect of the fraud, was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, with full restitution of all monies stolen, plus a $100,000 fine. The judge specifically noted that the betrayal of an elderly stepfather who had raised the defendant from age 11 was an aggravating factor she would not overlook. Crystal Mitchell received 4 years in federal prison and 5 years of supervised release. The notary Darla Hutchins, whose cooperation had been substantial, received 18 months and lost her commission permanently. The appraiser Curtis Yelvington, who had a pattern of similar offenses, received 5 years. The loan officer Patrice Donnelly received 2 years and was permanently barred from working in the financial industry. Reed Voss, the defense attorney, was later sanctioned by the Georgia Bar for suborning false testimony from the Henderson couple. He's still practicing, but his reputation in Savannah has not recovered. I didn't attend Brandon's sentencing. Rosalind asked me if I wanted to give a victim impact statement. I thought about it for 2 days. In the end, I wrote a letter and asked her to read it into the record. It was 3 paragraphs long. I said that I had loved Brandon as my own son, that I had stood with his mother as she made him promise on her deathbed to look after me, and that he had broken that promise in a way I could not have imagined. I said that I forgave him because I had to forgive him in order to keep on living, but that forgiveness was not the same as restoration. I said the relationship between us was over, and that I wished him well in whatever life he chose to build after he served his time. I never sent him a copy of the letter. I doubt he'll ever read it. About 4 months after the sentencing, a letter arrived from a women's federal facility in Tallahassee. Crystal had written me from prison. It was 8 pages long, and it was the kind of letter a person writes when they've had too much time to think and not enough people to talk to. She said she was sorry. She said Brandon had pressured her, that he'd manipulated her, that she'd been weak. She said she missed her old life. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I respected her a little for that. I read the letter once, folded it, and put it in a drawer. I never wrote her back. Brandon never wrote me at all. It's been almost 2 years now since Howard Pemberton rang my doorbell at 6:43 in the morning. Eleanor's roses are still blooming in the back garden. I've taken up restoring antique mantel clocks, which is a fiddly hobby that requires patience and a steady hand and a willingness to work on something for months before you see results. I find it suits me. Last fall, I drove up to Asheville and spent 2 weeks with my brother Hank. He's 78 now and slowing down, but he still beats me at chess. I've started attending a Wednesday evening supper club at the Methodist Church on Bull Street, mostly widows and widowers of a certain age, and last month a woman named Frances brought me a peach cobbler, and I haven't quite figured out what to do about that yet. Eleanor would tell me to stop being a fool and accept the cobbler, so I probably will. I think sometimes about what I learned from all of this. I'd spent my whole career investigating fraud committed by strangers against strangers. I never imagined I'd be the victim. I think the lesson I'd offer to anyone listening is this. When somebody you love starts asking you to sign things, slow down. Read every page. If you don't understand it, ask somebody who isn't related to you. Keep your important documents in a place only you can access. Use the same notary every time, somebody who knows your face. And remember that love, real love, never requires you to surrender your judgment. The people who genuinely care about you will be the first to encourage you to be careful. The people who don't will be the ones rushing you to sign. Justice is a quiet thing, in my experience. It doesn't shout from the end of a driveway. It doesn't record itself for content. It works slowly, methodically, the way a good clock works, every gear turning in its proper time, until the chime sounds and the truth is announced to the room. I sat for 32 years on the side of a desk that helped that machinery turn. I never thought I'd need it for myself, but when I did, it was there, and it did its job. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone you love, maybe somebody who needs to hear that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, even at 71 years old. And in the comments, tell me what city you're listening from, and whether you've ever had to set a hard boundary with someone in your own family. I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next story.